In this lecture, we'll be talking about the historiography of the Renaissance and Enlightenment. So, a bit of historical background. In a sense, 13th century Europe, a period we often associate with what we would call the High Middle Ages, was the best things had been, speaking generally, since the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. Right? So, you had this idea of recovery from the empire. This is kind of the high point. And I have this image of St. Francis to illustrate that, because this is a picture of him giving cloth to a poor man. And the idea is that Francis was a son of a wealthy urban cloth maker. Right? So this is a Europe that is kind of moving away from simply being agricultural to having urbanization and all the cultural advantages that that brings. And I remember one historian in the Middle Ages saying the 13th century was a good time for humanity. And then in the 14th century, poor Europe gets hit by the plague, by the bubonic plague, by the Black Death, whatever you want to call it. It hits Europe very hard. Numbers vary, but perhaps something like a third of the population dies in the 14th century. And that is also connected to famine, to a lot of problems. Especially what it was happening was the population had gone up because things were so good that there wasn't enough nutrition or enough food, so people had poor nutrition. And then there was also global cooling, which meant that the growing season was shorter. Lots of bad things going on in 14th century Europe. So you had this good time and then a really, really bad time. And that bad time helps lead to the Renaissance, right? What we would call the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, and you may recall this from History 121, but we'll do a little bit of a review. There was this idea that we can deal with the problems we face today by looking back to the ancient past, right? Let's look back to what the Greeks and the Romans in particular were doing, right? Let's see what answers they had to humanity's problems. And this would be centered in Italy, for a couple of very important reasons. One was its very strong connection with the Roman Empire, being that Rome is in Italy. If you were Italian, you could actually see the ancient remains of the Roman Empire, and a lot of times these dwarfed the buildings that your current civilization had been making. Right? Things like the Colosseum were just gigantic. So there was this sense that there was these ancient empires that had once been where you now lived and which were greater. So why not look back to them for assistance? Now, having ideas is great and fantastic, but you need money, right, to do anything. And Italy was a very important center of banking and international trade. Francis, who I mentioned earlier, had been part of an Italian cloth producing family in a city. Right, so the Italy is going to be a center of the Renaissance because they have the inspiration from the Roman Empire in part, and also because they have the money to follow through. And what's going on here, and this is going to affect history a lot, is there's going to be a shift in the understanding of how religion works. Don't so much think of the Renaissance as simply a time of secularization. Sometimes people say, well, this is a time when religion became less important. And as we'll see with Machiavelli, it does. I mean, there's certainly thinkers that move away from that. But for a period of time where religion was supposed to be becoming less important, wow, did they make a lot of pictures of the Virgin Mary and Jesus, right? I don't think that's quite correct to say that religion is suddenly becoming unimportant. It's not. What's happening, though, is that there's a questioning of old understandings of religion. People are saying, maybe we need to go back and read the Bible, or I should say the New Testament, in the original Greek. Maybe we should do that. They've been relying on a Latin translation that I believe had been around since the 5th century. So let's go back to those ancient sources. And in a sense, that's what a large part of the Protestant Reformation was saying, let's go back to these ancient sources. They've maybe been corrupted. Let's go back and try and fix things. Right? So there's this question of old understandings based on ancient models. That is obviously going to have an impact on how people use history. And there's a greater focus on humanity as an excellent creation of God. And that kind of creates a space for more history. right? History has typically focused on human action. And as we saw in the previous lecture on historiography, where we looked at the Middle Ages, there was a tendency to focus more on God's action. Well, in the Renaissance, again, it's not rejecting, for the most part, religious ideas, but it's trying to make more room for human action. And all this, I want to stress, is spurred on by the invention of the printing press. Right? The printing press is very important for historical work because it makes it possible to produce large amounts of historical work, to share it, for historians to talk to each other, to argue, and also for people to start reading history for fun, for entertainment purposes. Right? As books become cheaper, more people can afford them, more people will want to learn to read since they'll actually have something to read, and one thing that people will be very hungry for is history. Now, to give you an example of how history is going to come into play during this time period, and how it's going to be seen as a practical area of knowledge, and how it's also connecting to religion, and this whole idea of questioning sources, we're going to look at something called the donation of Constantine. Right? So you remember Constantine, right? The guy who, the Roman emperor who became a Christian, and that led to the toleration of Christianity. Well, the Vatican, the popes, had in their possession a document that supposedly proved that Constantine had made the Pope the ruler of Rome. Right? Remember, Constantine had moved his capital to Constantinople, and so he wasn't in Rome anymore. So this document said that the popes had been given Rome to rule over, and the popes did rule Rome during this time period. This strengthened their legitimacy. Now, one thing also that's very important, and so this document was just very important for popes, that said, look, we have a right to be in charge of Rome. In addition, this kind of continued this idea of the continuity of the contemporary world with the Roman Empire. Remember how we talked about how there was that idea from the book of Daniel about the four empires, that the Roman Empire be the last one? And there was a sense for Western Christians, especially Catholics, to feel that they were living in the Roman Empire. And even though the Roman Empire had fallen in the West, well, Charlemagne kind of brought it back, and the Holy Roman Empire is still around, so Rome is still going on. So for many people, even though their historical change had been going on, they didn't conceptualize that change. They didn't see the change. They saw themselves as just living in this continuous Roman Empire. So what happens then is the man pictured to the right, Lorenzo Valla, himself a Catholic, right? The Protestant Reformation has not started. This guy was a devout Catholic. But he looked at this document, the donation of Constantine. He used his knowledge of classical Latin to prove that it was in fact a forgery, right? That this document was not written by Constantine. Now, how did he do that? He did it by showing that the Latin that was used in that document used words and phrases that did not exist in ancient Latin documents. So you can kind of think about like this, basically. Imagine if someone claimed that they had found a long-lost letter written by Abraham Lincoln. And the letter started off, "Hey, bruh, what's up?" We would know instantly that this letter was a forgery. It is clearly not by Abraham Lincoln because people in the 19th century did not say, "Hey, bruh, what's up?" That's basically what Lorenzo Valla did. Now, I want to emphasize, the popes had actually been tricked on this. This was not something that the Pope forged. Someone else had forged it, said, "Hey, Pope, I found this. Isn't this a cool document? It supports you." And the popes were like, "Great, wonderful. This is helpful." So I don't want you to think this was some kind of diabolical plot by the popes. That being said, our purpose here, like I just want to stress, is this in a sense represents a break. This helps to open up this concept that maybe we're living in a new age. Right? There was those four empires that had existed, right? The Roman Empire continues. But increasingly in the 15th century, there's a sense we're kind of different from Rome. And we're different from that period earlier that claimed to be Rome. So really, there's three periods of history. Ancient, which was the Romans and the Greeks. The medieval period, which was up to like the 14th century, and then now. And this is often how people even today talk about history. There's the ancient, there's the medieval, and then there's the modern. Some people will go on and say that we're now in the postmodern period. I think it's interesting that they say we're in the after-modern period rather than coming up with a new period name, which kind of shows some of the difficulties within postmodernism. But what I want to stress here, discoveries, proofs, like what Lorenzo Vallo has done, has shown people that we're living in kind of a different time, right? We're living in a different time. He breaks that continuity. There was this time, the ancient time, then there was the time afterwards, and now we're living in a new age. So it's no longer the four empires, it's ancient, medieval, now. And in a sense, one of the people who really you most likely have heard of, Niccolo Machiavelli, who represents this massive shift in how we think about history. Right? So usually you think about Niccolo Machiavelli as a political thinker, and he certainly was. But we have to stress during this time period that political thinking was often connected to ancient history. So to give you some background, Niccolo Machiavelli lived in Florence, which is where the Medici family basically governed. And Niccolo Machiavelli and others did not like the Medici being in control. And there was a struggle in Florence in the 15th century over the control of Florence and what kind of government it should have, with some wanting more kind of one-person rule or one-family rule, and others wanting more of a republic. And Machiavelli would write commentaries on Livy, right? Remember Livy, that Roman historian we looked at? Well, he does the same thing. And he also writes a history of Florence as well. But what's key is, especially in the commentaries on Livy, he has this admiration of Roman Republican virtue and this idea that this virtue can help make Florence strong and build a good government. In addition, what's curious is he shifts from this kind of universal Christian history to something more local and national. People like Bede, who you recall we talked about earlier, this Christian historian who's trying to talk about whose history is based around the conversion of the English to Christianity and how that leads to a new kingdom. But he tries still to connect it to Rome, to a universal world order based around Christianity, of which England is just a part. But for Niccolo Machiavelli, Florence is what's most important, and he doesn't really bother to connect it to universal Christian history. In fact, his focus on history is this kind of idea that is driven by conflict and power, not by a divine plan. Right? Bede and other Christian authors were always looking for miracles, for signs of God's providence. And when something went wrong, they would focus on ideas, well, something went wrong because we sinned and God is punishing us. Remember, you had this idea of repentance, of God making a kind of covenant. Christians got this from Judaism. God makes a kind of covenant. People keep it for a while, but then they fail. God punishes them. They repent and come back. That's kind of how Christian history worked. But for Niccolo Machiavelli, the focus is on history is driven by conflict and power. That's how he understands Florentine history, not by God having some kind of divine plan that governs them.